Hey, welcome back to a new YouTube video. Today we're going to talk about intermittent fasting, training in a fasted state, and I want to look specifically at the active or athletic female population. Before we look at the active population, we want to look at where did intermittent fasting or the fasting research in generally started, and it started with the clinical or in the clinical population. So for people who were severely obese and needed to lose weight for surgery, for example, worked really well in them and also brought health markers up. And so in general, in men or in women, it has a positive health impact when you're sedentary, when you're inactive, when you're obese, have diabetes or pre-diabetic. So in this population, fasting has brought tremendous health benefits. And now we want to look at, do the same positive impacts happen in an athletic population? Today in this video, especially on an athletic female population. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's just think or create a scenario that is very common today. So you fast overnight because you don't eat overnight, you're sleeping, and then you wake up in the morning at 6 a.m., 7 a.m. or whatever, and then you get dressed and you go for a run or you go to the gym. And you may drink some water, may have a cup of coffee, but you're not eating anything. And then you go to the gym, you do your training session, you go for a run, you do your training session, and come back and maybe you eat afterwards. That is a typical fasted training session. With intermittent fasting, you have specific protocols that you can follow. So you can do 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of an eating window, for example. They're different. You have like daily fasting or those hours of fasting. And so depending on which structure or protocol you follow, you have different obviously a different thing that you do. And so if you, for example, do intermittent fasting, or if you decide to go for intermittent fasting and do those 16 hours of fasting, so you would, for example, wake up in the morning, drink your coffee, drink your water, go for your training session. But if you don't, if your fasting window hasn't ended, you might not get something to eat right afterwards, or you schedule your training session so that you can eat right after your training session when your fasting window ends. Personally, I tried the 16 8-hour fasting, and I also tried a lighter version later on, but I did 16 hours, so I had like my last meal at like 8 p.m. and then ate somewhere around lunchtime, made sure that I had my training session before my fasting window ended, and then ate something directly afterwards. That was what I did, and I know a lot of others do that as well, but again, there are different scenarios or different protocols you can follow. So if you're a woman and you add intermittent fasting on top of your training session or your training, or going to a training session fasted, this is what can happen. It can harm your health and it can harm your performance. This sounds really harsh and really worrisome, but let's look deeper into it. So we'll look at kisspeptin first. Kisspeptin is a hormone, and it basically is an important hormone that starts the release of several other hormones, especially your sex hormones. And therefore it is really important for endocrine health, for reproductive health. In women, it seems that kisspeptin is more sensitive, and especially more sensitive to a calorie deficit or calorie reduction. And let's remember that fasting or intermittent fasting or getting into a training session fasted can easily reduce the total calories consumed, which is often what we're striving for when we're going for intermittent fasting, because you don't have as much time to eat. So naturally, or most likely, your overall calorie consumption is reduced. But oftentimes that deficiency in calories leads to a reduction in kisspeptin stimulation, and therefore to a disruption in endocrine health, like, for example, menstrual cycle dysfunction or irregularities or losing your menstrual cycle. And we want to also highlight that having a menstrual cycle is part of being a healthy woman. And so if you have, or if you lose your menstrual cycle, that really is a signal of your body that something is off, especially when you're looking at hormonal balance. In the beginning, I would say most women, whether they're sedentary or usually inactive, or whether they're fit and active, most women will probably experience a positive results from intermittent fasting or training in that fasted state. However, it is usually the long-term effects or the long-term impacts that really bring trouble with them. And so when we look at them, long-term effects often, but not always, result in those endocrine dysfunctions, increases in abdominal fat, increases in depression, and anxiety, and oftentimes also a decrease in performance. And that increase in abdominal fat is often because of an increase in cortisol, which is your stress hormone. But we will get into that in detail in a little bit. Research on intermittent fasting, on fasting and training, has been predominantly done on the male population, on obese population, and there's also some quite a wide variety of research on the population who's doing Ramadan. Not so much, however, on the female and especially active female or athletic female population. However, it looks like women do not respond to fasted training the same way that men do. And so we want to go back to what I just said about the cortisol and increase in cortisol. So when you're sleeping during the night, your cortisol levels naturally go up. We want them to go up, and they peak in the morning. And here's what we see. So when you're eating before you run, and that will increase your blood sugar, and that will help bring that cortisol back down. If you, however, continue to fast and then train, your cortisol will stay elevated and will not come back down. Your cortisol is your stress hormone, and cortisol itself is or has a catabolic effect on your muscle or on protein synthesis. Over time, that chronic high levels of cortisol can drive immune stress, can drive inflammation, and it's also shown to increase muscle tissue damage, and breakdown, leading to potential losses in muscle or lean mass. So the current research indicates that intermittent fasting or training in a fasted state in the active female population can lead to a high sympathetic drive of the nervous system. In men, it leads to a parasympathetic drive, so rest and digest mode, but we women are getting into that sympathetic drive where we're more in that anxious fight or flight mode. And it also increases cortisol, which I said in itself has a catabolic effect, and it also increases brain fog. Intermittent fasting has shown and is advertised to bring clarity of mind and focus and reduce brain fog. This has been seen in men and is a parasympathetic response. But in women, we have that sympathetic response, so that sympathetic drive where we're more in that fight or flight mode, and so we get more anxious when we're fasted, we get more depressed, we have elevated heart rate, we also have brain fog, we can have sleep disturbances, and all of that can also, again, lead to some of those hormonal issues. We can potentially see an increase in abdominal fat. You can see hormonal disruptions, again, due to this peptin, low energy availability, so no periods, irregular periods. We also see malnutrition, so too little micro and macronutrients. Especially women have a tendency of eating too little and getting into that low energy state, so low energy availability state. And fasting or intermittent fasting, training in a fasted state, often contributes to this low energy availability state. And there's a really interesting study on female endurance athletes, and that showed the following. So in this study, the setup essentially was they wanted them to train, and they made sure that they were eating something before they went into their training session. What they didn't do was they didn't eat a lot or had a very long period of not eating after that training session. And they made sure that over the entire day, they were eating enough calories to keep up the right energy levels, so they weren't going into that low energy availability state where they were eating insufficient calories or were in the calorie deficient state. So they wanted to make sure that they had enough calories consumed over the entire day, but they had this huge gap where they were in a catabolic state and didn't eat after their training session for several hours. And what happened is that they ended up with reproductive abnormalities. So they had irregular menstrual cycles, they had anovulatory cycles, amenorrhea, and that was all due to that disturbance or perturbance in kisspeptin and that low energy availability state that they were in during this long time of not eating. And so even though they tried to eat enough, or even though they were eating enough, they were not able to take care of keeping their endocrine cycle or keeping their endocrine health where you want it to be, so in a healthy, balanced state. If you now think, and I know that a lot of you may think that, you're not an athlete, so therefore intermittent fasting or training in a fasted state can still work for you, I want you to think again. Because do you train on purpose? Do you train to stay healthy and perform well? Is that something that you want to do? Do you train regularly? And do you also hit higher intensities every now and then? So on a regular basis. Don't get me wrong, intermittent fasting can work. Training in fasted state can work. It can work for men, it can work for women. But most active women, or most women, or part of the female active population and athletes, they perform better in a fed state. And it keeps their endocrine and overall health in a better state. They have overall better endocrine balance or hormonal balance. And especially when you're looking at higher intensities, things like a long duration training session, or an endurance, like endurance running, or CrossFit classes, or max lifting sessions. When you look at those things, being in a fed state is a key requirement to be able to tap into those higher intensities. And so the outcome of body composition, aerobic and anaerobic fitness, and adaptation, as well as muscle building, so protein synthesis, they seem to be better when a woman is in a fed state and trains in a fed state. And looking at it from both a health and performance standpoint, intermittent fasting or training in a fasted state, so even if you don't do intermittent fasting but train a fasted state regularly, this applies to you as well, this fasted training does not seem to yield any extra benefit to your training session. So if you're looking to improve your body composition, your health, and your performance as a woman, you will have a much better chance at reaching this sustainably and without negative health and performance impacts by fueling for your training and your daily life, and thereby reducing that catabolic state, ergo keeping your metabolism high, and maintaining and building muscle mass and being in a healthier hormonal state. Think about food as fuel, okay? I also want to point out, and that was really interesting, there's one female population that seems, whether they are active or not, that seems to benefit from intermittent fasting specifically, and that is women with PCOS. So if that is something that you struggle with, or that you feel like you're affected at, then you can look into the research. I will put it in the description below and see if that is something that you want to try or that you want to go through with your doctor. And I also want to highlight that in obese and sedentary or the more inactive population, male or female, intermittent fasting, training in a fasted state, they have great health benefits. And it is nothing that is evil or it doesn't work. But we want to make sure that we look at the athletic population differently as we look the sedentary population. If you're more in that athletic population where you care about your health and your performance at the same time, especially the female population, that the fasting or training in a fasted state can have negative health impacts. And so I want you to take that into consideration to help you decide whether or not you want to try it, or whether you want to go and do a fasted training session or not. Okay, next point, you still want to try intermittent fasting. No worries, I got you covered. There is a way that you can try this without going all in at first. So there is something called a light version of intermittent fasting. I've tried that myself and it worked really well for me. Better than the 16 hours fasting, 8 hours of eating. So as I said, there is just the standard of 16 hours, 20-hour fasting. But what I would like for you to try is maybe try a 12-hour fast overnight or a 13-hour fast overnight. That can look like something like this, where you have your last meal at 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening. So let's say 8 p.m. And then you can have your breakfast at 8 a.m. So if you decide to have dinner at 7, having your breakfast between 7 and 8 a.m., will give you a 12 to 13 hour fasting window. And so you can still make sure that you have something before you go into your training session. You had your 12 to 13 hour fasting window, and that seems to work quite well because you don't have that super long fasting window, and you also don't go into your training session in a fasted state because you're trying to get something in beforehand. So if that works really well, if you feel like, okay, 12 to 13 hours of fasting, that worked really well for me, I'm feeling great, I'm doing good, my training is great, you don't experience any disbalances, hormonal disbalances or something like that, you can try and go for 14 hours of fasting and play with that. So you're basically your own experiment. You can try this for yourself and see what works for you and what doesn't work for you. But I also want to point out that 1 week of fasting will not show you, or 2 weeks of fasting, 3 weeks of fasting will not show you what it will look like in a year. So there are differences between short-term effects and long-term effects, what I talked about earlier. Typically, I have some clients who did intermittent fasting or did go into a training session fasted, and they had a really hard time getting something or eating something before their training session. So they wanted to go for a run at 6 a.m. in the morning. They were like, I'm not gonna eat breakfast at 5 a.m. to go on a run at 6 a.m. I was like, yeah, I totally understand that. So if you're one of those who has like a morning CrossFit class or a morning run scheduled, you don't have to eat an entire breakfast. What often does the trick is 100 to 150 calories of protein and carbs. That can look something like yogurt with granola, that can be a protein bar, an energy bar that you did yourself at home. That can be half a banana with peanut or almond butter. I prefer almond butter, but really you're more of a peanut fan than you peanut butter. So anything that gives you quick energy, has protein and carbs, that usually works really well, and it doesn't have to be a lot. You also want to make sure that you don't have any GI distress when you're consuming that. Typically what I recommend is getting something that is low in fiber, so you don't have any of those distresses, and something that you know that you can digest well and feel good with mentally and physically. So when you're fasting, I want you to consider the following. I want you to look at your hunger levels, your stress. Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it remain the same? You want to look at sleep quality and quantity. You want to look at your sex drive, your performance in life and in the gym. You want to look at your mood, and you want to look at your overall energy. Is there a difference in energy in the gym or in life from before you did incorporate some kind of fasting protocol? And here's a quick tip for anyone who's thinking about starting a diet or starting to try intermittent fasting. The best time to start this as a female is in the follicular phase. So shortly or with the onset of your menstruation, or just after menstruation, after your period is over. In this low hormone phase, it is typically easier to stick to a diet or to a certain eating regime because our hunger levels are lower. When we're getting into that higher hormone phase, so after ovulation, what often happens is that our overall hunger and cravings go up because our overall caloric need goes up with that extra tissue that is being built and tried to maintain. And so we have an increase in overall caloric need of 100 to 300 calories per day during that time, so during that high hormone phase. And so it can be really hard to stick to our diet or to our eating regime that we're trying to maintain. So start in that follicular phase, in that low hormone phase, and set yourself up for success, because it's way easier to start there and get into like some kind of habit when you're in this phase. Generally speaking, and I know I'm repeating myself, women seem to benefit more from maintaining a regular flow of high quality calories throughout the day. But it is still up to you as an individual to decide what works best for you and your body. I want you to consider the implications of fasted training on your training sessions and on your long-term health. And I want you to be aware of it, but it is upon you to decide what works for you and how you feel when you're doing fasted training, when you're doing intermittent fasting, or when you're training in a fed state. The last point I want to look at is, when do you want to stop intermittent fasting or training in a fasted state? So if that is something you've done for a while or you're starting and then you see some of the following things happening, that is a clear signal that something is off and you want to reconsider and most likely stop intermittent fasting or training in the fasted state. So your periods become irregular or absent. You have trouble sleeping, falling asleep, or staying asleep, so your quality and quantity of sleep or one of either decrease. You feel under-recovered or overtrained. Your mood swings are more intense, and they occur more often than usual. You get sick more easily. You feel stressed all the time, and you get that like every flu that is around or every cold you seem to catch, so you have impaired immunity. And if you feel cold most of the time, that can also be a sign. So if one of those things is happening, for example, mood swings are more intense, this is not a huge thing, but it's something that you want to consider. If something like troubles with sleep or your period is occurring, that is a huge sign that you definitely want to do something about, okay? I want to finish with this. There's not a lot of data that I could find. There's some really interesting and good articles out there. There's some research that I found really interesting. I'll put some of them in the description below so you can have a look at them yourself. But the data that I could find or the articles that I read all point into the direction that fasted training, especially intermittent fasting as well, but especially that training in that fasted state, usually has or can lead to really major health and performance impacts for female athletes or the fit athletic female population. If you want to, you can experiment with both fasted and fed training. Personally, and with my clients, I usually try to encourage them to have something to eat before they're getting into their training session. But there's also a lot of mental stuff going on. So I know that a lot of women are doing intermittent fasting because they're trying to lose weight, because they feel like they need to look a certain way, and intermittent fasting seems like a good way to go because you just don't have enough time to eat. But I really want you to think about the long-term effects, the long-term health and performance implication that it can have with it. If, however, you're among those who feel really great with it and feel like you can perform well, you feel good, you don't have any menstrual cycle disturbances, I don't want you to kick you off the board of intermittent fasting, okay? So if that is something that you enjoy doing, that you feel good with, keep on doing it. If you're someone who has been struggling with it or hasn't been seeing a lot of positive results with it over the years or time that you've been doing it, reconsider it, try something else. Get off that intermittent fasting, try to eat something before your training session, and experiment with yourself and your own experiences, your own body, and what you're feeling is doing or serving you well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I would really appreciate a thumbs up. I would appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. If you're considering working with me, I do offer one-on-one coaching. You can find a link to a free consulting call below where you can get in touch with me. And if you have any questions regarding this topic of fasting, intermittent fasting, training as a woman, please put it in the description below or get in touch with me. I will do my best to answer or get into a discussion with you.